thing I think to remember is that we're going to be going pretty wide with a general overview of all this information. And so it's like the four of us have talked about many times, Char Brown made a great point about staying solutions oriented when it's a concept this big and when the information can tend to make you uncomfortable. And so what I think we want to remember is that the funnel will hopefully narrow, and that whatever information we start talking about today, you can take back to your region, to your parish, to your town, to your organization, and figure out what does that mean for you. And so that's really why we're here today, is to talk about something that's so important, and that our role in it as cultural people, as arts and culture bearers and workers and all those different titles, we have an important role to play in this. And I know that Maida's going to go far deeper into the research that she's done these last couple of years, but it's been fascinating just for me in proximity to what she's discovered and how she sort of worked through this and how this project came to be with the help of folks like Jonathan here on the call who have instigated this conversation. And so that's kind of how we got here today. It's just acknowledging that it's a statewide issue. It's not just a coastal issue. Barry with the Northeast Louisiana Arts Council really took me aback one day when he was like, well, what are we supposed to do? And I'm from the Northeast corner. And that was the first time that I had thought of that as well. And so I think, some people have dealt with this every day for years, and some people won't deal with it for years. And so I think as we just keep that in mind and realize that we're probably all at various stages of even using the term land loss in our cultural work and our artistic work, and then figuring out how do we go from here with what is considered a wicked problem, right? There seems to be no way to solve it.
Yeah, Kelsey referred to this as a wicked problem. That is actually a technical term among the scientists, that and climate change is called a super wicked problem. I love that that is a technical term within the science world. What we want to do today is find out who might be interested in participating in dialogues with the environmentalists and the scientists and the policymakers, to bring cultural issues and our resources to the conversation. Right now, we are basically not part of that conversation. It's not that they don't want us, it's just that it just hasn't occurred to them. They do talk about community resilience, but when they talk about community resilience, they're talking about things like planting mangroves to buffer your community from a hurricane. And I have a feeling none of you thought of that when we talk about community resilience. So we can broaden that community. Note that during the presentations, we'd like you to think about what else you might need to be ready to talk with policymakers, or and to consider how your organization might resolve. What you're looking at right now is they call the environmentalists call the red map, because it's alarming, it's jarring, and many of them don't like it. But this is the naked truth, that amazing amounts of land have been lost and will be lost. This one only focuses on Southeast Louisiana, but that's true across the coast. Now, this map shows what's happening what will happen nationally. All the areas in blue will lose land to the ocean. The red and purple are counties that will see increased migration, and the darker the county, the red, the more migration will go there. So I'm going to present different questions during this time. Don't expect answers today, but these are some of the issues that we want to pose collectively. Why art and culture? What role might the arts play in these migrations? Why does paying attention to culture matter in these conversations? And how your arts organization could be a creative part of the solution. What happens to our coastal cultures as migration increases? And very importantly, Jonathan contributed this. What will our grandchildren wish we had done? LA Safe is a report that came out in 2019, and it acknowledges that we have an existential threat with the coast and climate change in writing. And you've probably heard about CPRA, but it only addresses the physical restoration of the coast. It is funded and it is mandated by the legislature. But LA Safe is only partially funded for specific projects only in Southeast Louisiana, but it does present a much more comprehensive plan. The good news is that scientists and policymakers have already acknowledged in this report that the human dimension needs to be considered. But note that when they refer to human dimension, it's much broader than culture and the arts. For example, it includes mental health. And more good news is that both CRT and the Office of Cultural Development, and one of the things you have to get used to is that there's another OCD, the Office of Community Development, rather than us being cultural development. And we are included in Goal 5 and arts specifically strategy 2. And it goes into some very specific things, recommends increased funding, but there is no funding now, and the timeline is long-term. Now, after Jonathan Foray invited the Louisiana Folklore Society to meet in Houma, and which prompted quite a lot of discussions over the last several years. What ended up happening is the Folklife program, me, and the Louisiana Folklore Society, with a lot of other organizations, created what we call the Bayou Culture Collaborative. So this is our response so far. I use my NEA Folk Arts Partnership money and some from the LDOA for basically 2 types of workshops. First is passing it on workshops, where we fund a master to pass on a tradition. This can be everything from a one-on-one apprenticeship to group workshops for both adults and youth. Some really creative multi-generational projects have happened. And we've done a pretty good job of addressing some of the most visible or acknowledged traditions of the coast. But the second type of workshop is called Sense of Place and Loss. And before COVID and the lockdowns, the focus was to do these full-day deep dive workshops. And Acadiana Center for the Arts very graciously hosted the first one back in September 19. And, but of course, with COVID, this was not really a possibility. But the idea is to start dialogues with science, culture, and policy. Brandon Bollinger brought this portable museum, he calls it, an exhibit about species extinction. And it was very well received. The second one was going to be the first week of the lockdown, so it had to be canceled. And since then, we've been doing some Zoom meetings, much more simple, shorter, of course. Who wants a whole all-day Zoom meeting? So y'all, this is one of the Zooms to broaden the conversation, mainly focused on the arts. All the Zooms have been focused on, the audience has been the arts and not the broader conversation. So, okay, Kelsey.
Muted. So as many times as I've done this, you'd think I'd be used to that by now. We sent out a survey whenever you guys registered for the event, right? And we're going to talk about the results probably when we get to Q&A. But the cool thing about these questions, Maida crafted these questions to sort of help guide us as we're moving through this conversation. And the cool thing about this list is that this can be somewhat modified depending on where you are. Like if your organization wants to have a meeting, or if you have, some type of community development event. I know me personally for the Cultural Districts program, it's definitely something that the districts can start to think about, start to use in that community development type of work. So I'm going to drop these in the chat for us just to think about as we keep going through this today. We may use them as prompts again. If y'all are quiet, I got a school teacher mama, so I'll call on you. But I think, the survey results that we've seen so far from those of you that participated, most of you haven't thought about if you would have to move or where you would have to go. And if you did have to move, would it be family? Would it be in-state, out of state? And so I think, when you start to think about these questions, they're seemingly simple, but what they insinuate is a pretty large concept about, human migration that's due to land loss. So I'm gonna drop these in the chat for us real quick.
And I want to point out that a lot of the imagery that we're using today is actually Monique's artwork. So I'm just kind of going to drop some ideas for you, that all culture is passed on through gatherings and education. They're critical for it to actually have, for this knowledge to pass on, but it can be both informally passed on or formally. And traditions and culture are less likely to be lost if we pass them on with intention. And I'm very focused on the word intention nowadays, because lots of things can be lost if you don't do it with intention, especially with migration and a lot of culture change. And I want to come back to that idea. What do you want your great-grandchildren to know about their culture? Do you want them to actually participate in some of the traditions and culture that you have? Okay, now Monique Verdun will share some of her thoughts.
So I have been kind of fascinated with U.S. Geological Survey maps, and I encourage everyone to use that resource. It's been very telling to kind of layer the maps of time in thinking about where we are in coastal South Louisiana is where I'm at. So it's changing a lot. But I'm sharing this map, and I'm curious how many folks might actually be able to know where we are. Of course, this is a USGS map, and you can kind of see these lines of division from, what is dry and what is wild Atchafalaya. And also there, just to what would be right next to the knife of the indigenous illustration, which is by Dupratz. I'm kind of been a little fascinated with his work as well. 18th century, first naturalists to come into the territory and to be recording peoples and plants and records. Some of the early colonial records come from his work. And so right there's a crossroads of places, which some of you may know now as Ornoville. And was, sacred trading grounds and a site of an Attakapaw Ishak village, not so far long ago, and a crossroads of bayous where the Bayou Fuselier and the Bayou Teche meet. And then if you look just to the kind of northwest of there, there's a medicine plant, again, an illustration by Dupratz, and it's a rattlesnake master, and that's in Prairie des Femmes. So I found myself at this crossroads shortly after Hurricane Katrina. I had never really been west of the Mississippi River, to be really honest, in Louisiana. You know, my people are from the Yakni-Shido, so south of Houma, Pointe-aux-Chenes specifically. My father's side are Houma. And my mother's people are, you know, old school, early colonizers of the territory, descendants of early colonizers of the territory, tied to the city of New Orleans. And so I'm evacuated like so many people, and we're not going home for days. And I ended up in Ville Platte, right, which is the northernmost place of South Louisiana, I was told, and also the smoked meat capital of the world for them, which I went from being a vegetarian to quickly eating crackling at the neighborhood gas station, and was quite grateful to find myself in this community where there was no FEMA, there was no Red Cross, there were no social services at the time because everything was upside down. And it was the community that came out to the community center, and people started organizing to set up computers so folks could get communications, have clothing for folks, because people were fleeing and they had nowhere to go. And then all of a sudden they're on the side of the road in Ville Platte, right? And during that time, I was there for quite some time. And we would take these long drives through the prairie. I learned how to two-step at Fred's Lounge in Mamou one Saturday morning at 8 a.m. You know, and then one day I found myself in Arnaudville, and we see this little kind of what looked like a gallery, maybe, but it was an old gas station and was the first Nunu's, which has since become a kind of a magnet of places, and has grown so much since that time. And I meet George Marks, and I meet his mama, and I meet some other community folks, and they're showing me these studios, and he opens a door, and I recognize the screen printer's work in there. And an old friend of mine from St. Bernard Parish, which of course we were completely flooded out, happened to find himself there too, and which was this funny kind of like, oh, you know, like I'm home, I know people, but also was welcomed in by strangers who, fast forward all these years later, are still my dear friends and continue Nunu's, but Arnaudville and that part of Acadiana has become a part of my heart, and a part of my community, and a place that I'm so grateful to know, and also a place that I always think of if I have to evacuate, that it might be a place where I could go and I could continue and I could have, yeah, a network. And so I'm just going to share my screen here.
I might have to stop share. We've never.
Okay, sure. Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
So I'm just gonna, I just have three slides that I want to share. So this, of course, is Nunu's, and to think back to that time where the gas station that was where the first gallery space was actually burned down, and then they moved to this amazing other space down the road where the gallery, and there's kind of like an event space, but then there was an older warehouse, old farm warehouse, and that was a great place for conferences that I participated in, and music and food, all kinds of things, right? Well, then a car ran into that, so I think that, you know, even these places that are on high ground have their own challenges as well. And I think Nunu's is always kind of like rising up out of the ashes, and they keep doing what they do, which has really been super inspiring. And they have this incredible St. Luke's French immersion and international connections that are really amazing. So, oh, sorry. And then Prairie des Femmes, so Woman's Prairie. Ashley Wilson Michaud is actually from Ville Platte, and we didn't know each other when I was evacuated into Ville Platte. We met years later after me going back to Arnaudville, not only in times of disaster, but in times of celebration for their Fire and Water Festival and other kinds of arts and educational opportunities. But Ashley is an amazing, beautiful, gifted human being who has been going deep into the French language, and her partner Louis Michaud is with the Lost Bayou Ramblers, and so I wanted to give a shout out to the Prairie, because it's also the first time I ever met Ashley was at her home in the Prairie. And she told me the story that the Prairie was a place of refuge for women, that in times of uncertainty or times of war, the Prairie has these old stories of women going there and having a safe place to go. And just to speak to community and collaboration, Au Malheur is a publication that, she brought together all of these women of Louisiana with French ties and put together this beautiful collection that just came out not too long ago. So that place and beautiful human beings, right? It's individuals that are stewarding these places. And just to my last Arnaudville I'm fan of is Atelier de la Nature, which is Brandon Boulanger, who was mentioned before, who I met at Nunu's. George Marks was like, you got to meet this guy. And Brandon and I have collaborated, and him and his partner Aurora and their children have this beautiful site that is also in Arnaudville, and both of them are not native Louisianians. Aurora is from the Champagne region of France, and Brandon's from the Midwest. Had been working in is an ichthyologist, so studies fish and frogs, but is an incredible artist and educator. And so I just want to kind of wrap up here and saying that community connections, neutral grounds where people can come together to share ideas, and also to recognize that we're in a huge state of, I'm going to stop sharing, a huge state of uncertainty in South Louisiana and globally, right? We're up against huge challenges. And I think that, when I had a documentary that came out a couple of years ago called My Louisiana Love. And we were working with this, workshopping with a story consultant on documentaries. And she asked, what's one sentence that sums up the film for you? And for me, and this resonates more than just the film, I think it just is something that's so core to my life, which is, and living through cycles of disaster. When you lose your sense of place, your family is your home. And sometimes your family isn't your blood. And sometimes your family is to remember it's the land you live upon and the life around you, right? That family comes in different forms, but communities and networks and relationships and helping each other to understand how we got here and to dream and imagine and work towards where we want to be collectively. So I'll end there.
Well, thank you, Monique.
Thanks.
I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the research about migration. So I'm going to read this, one, to keep me focused on task and do it in a concise way. In Louisiana, many of us are aware of sea level rise because of our extreme coastal land loss. The closer you are to the coast, the more aware you are, and the more likely that you or someone you know has had to move. Louisiana and all the other large river deltas are feeling the effects sooner than other types of coast. Even though there are more and more news articles about displacement of communities due to climate change, much of the general public really hasn't been thinking about this. Geographers, on the other hand, have been looking at this issue for quite a while. The graphic you see is from the research of Matthew Hauer at Florida State University. He's done the most research into predicting where people will move. Using big data, in this case, US tax return address changes, he projects where people will move. It's known that people tend to relocate to be closer to family or for jobs. And the changes in our tax return addresses help predict where people will move. If you look clockwise, you'll see 10 states that will lose the most people. After Florida, Texas, New York, and Louisiana, California, Louisiana is 5th. And note how much larger all those other states are than Louisiana. Of those leaving Louisiana, the most will move to Texas. And just, okay, so here's Louisiana, and this is the line that they're going to be moving to Texas. But note how few other lines there are. There are a few minor ones going out, but for the most part, Louisiana people are most likely to relocate somewhere within the state. From the same research, this graphic shows that Louisiana is 2nd in the net loss of population. And again, even though we have significantly less population. So what does this mean for Louisiana? Louisiana has the highest rate of native-born residents in the country. Terrebonne Parish has the highest rate in Louisiana, and it's also the parish with the most land loss. Many will relocate several times because they don't want to move too far from family and friends, and many already have. The communities where they move are called receiver communities. Some communities will lose population, but some will grow, and some will grow a lot. Some communities that are receiving today may not be in years to come. People will be moving from them. Some receiver communities may not be too happy about having all these newcomers descend upon them, especially if there are cultural differences. And the cultural differences don't have to be that large. People have been moving from Chauvin to a neighborhood in Houma, and the long-term residents are annoyed that the newcomers don't blend in. Since Hurricane Katrina, we have seen this in New Orleans, but many of those newcomers are from out of state and enthusiastically embrace the local culture. What happens when large numbers arrive in both rural and urban communities, but don't embrace the local culture? Now, this type of large migration has happened throughout human history, including Louisiana's. In 1809, 10,000 Haitians arrived in New Orleans and doubled the population, forever changing that culture. Another issue is that many receiver communities don't have the physical infrastructure to handle the increase in population. And this is especially a problem for rural communities. Note that rural people tend to move to other rural communities. So I know that's a lot to take in, but we will have time to discuss things. So next, Dr. Charbrion Plumer will give another point of view about migrations.
Thank you, Maida. Hi, everyone. So for context, I work at the Arts Council of Greater Baton Rouge, title as Director of Advocacy and Artist Services, and I am really happy to see everyone today. But one of the things that I'm always sort of thinking about or putting at the forefront is like who is or is not a part of this conversation. So for me, I just wanted to take a few moments to talk about, as I've gotten to know Maida's work and incorporating my own sort of experiences and Monique's and Kelsey, et cetera. One of the things that I thought would be important to touch on is bringing in an intersectional viewpoint. So when I say intersectional, I'm sure folks have heard the term intersectionality coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And intersectionality is this interconnected nature of social categorization. So whether it be race, class, gender, and they are regarded as overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So for me, when I'm thinking about adaptation and land loss as a Black woman growing up in and born and raised and now back residing in South Louisiana, I am thinking about everyone is affected, but who may be affected disproportionately. So oftentimes when we're addressing these social issues, we tend to segment them off or do this collective grouping, like we're all feeling it, which we are, but that doesn't necessarily allow for a holistic analysis of the issues that face our community members based on these layered identifiers, right? So some of what I'll be talking about today is built off of my own experience, like I said, research from scholars such as Dean Hardy, Richard Milligan, and Nick Haynen, who are sort of raising this discussion around race-aware adaptation. So how is this connected to land loss? First, I think that it's important to look to history at the correlation between land settlement and what I'm referring to as racialized projects versus just saying race. So to kind of backtrack a little bit, events like Katrina or areas like Cancer Alley, again, back to this point of thinking intersectionally, while they're deeply impactful to all, sort of demonstrated to us and continue to demonstrate how people of color in the South have been disproportionately affected by environmental hazards, such as extreme weather events, land loss, toxic substance releases, poor water quality, et cetera. But if we're thinking about sort of land settlement and thinking about history across the spectrum, we know that colonization and enslavement ultimately led to the erasure of indigenous communities and people of African descent, and ultimately left a huge void in terms of cultural memory. So for centuries, we've seen sort of this incremental erasure that's already occurred, and then that's compounded by what we're facing with climate change. So I'm advocating for us as arts leaders, workers, et cetera, to have a more transparent and honest discussion around sort of the forced racialization of particular areas, towns, and cities, and how a lot of folks were relegated to, or really had no choice but to settle in certain areas, whether it was due to policies, economic barriers, safety concerns, or even how that may have informed the intention around where people wanted to call home, because they were able to connect with folks that maintained a sense of community that survived despite all of these barriers that I just listed. We can even take it a step further to look at how variations in class and geography inform how communities have come to rely on one another when those same sort of policies, et cetera, favor more privileged members of their communities versus them. I think it's really special having groups of RACs here because you're one step ahead. You have these convenings and these meetings. Same thing with the cultural districts, and Kelsey and Maida, the conversations that you're facilitating allow folks to be in conversation with one another, to share those experiences, observations, and histories so that we can look to the past, understand ourselves better, and then start to project forward. So I want to say that kudos to y'all. Additionally, we know that the cultural byproducts of sort of race and ethnicity didn't occur by happenstance, and as places evolve, so do people, so does cultural production, et cetera. A sort of like fun example I wanted to reference to think about the coast as a whole, both as Louisiana, but along the South, is in coastal Georgia, for instance, how you have Gullah and Geechee people, and what was produced by those groups was labeled as such and had social and cultural and intellectual implications that allowed them to really sort of claim this heritage, even though it was a sort of moniker that was placed on them. In turn, they were able to sort of claim this for themselves. And when those folks start to disappear, so does that memory. We see it happen here in our own state as well. These individuals are people who have inhabited a place for so long, and they can't be separated from place. Like one thing I think that I've been sort of reckoning with personally is like not saying, oh, well, we have people, we have culture, we have this, we have that. I think it's important to group them all together. So like, for example, you might have culture bearers who produce this work, but there are also individuals who know the land, who know the plants, the creatures, all the nuances of home intimately. And if folks are departing or if they're forced out, that priceless knowledge leaves with it. It's sort of this symbiotic relationship. And for me, I really am passionate about figuring out how we can continue to support folks through this separation, because it's difficult and hard and overwhelming, especially when you're sort of forced to do it. And I know for many of us, although we aren't necessarily in that place to have to make immediate shifts, although with our weather now, who knows, it can be sort of overwhelming to think about in terms of projecting ahead. So the next bullet, so this need for equity around language and decision-making. I also think it's important to be intentional about, back to your word, Maida, about how we categorize things. So like here I put like terms like environmental racism, or even saying land loss versus climate change. Like you say climate change, okay, well the climate's changing. So, and whereas even something as simple as land loss for me begins to make it real and help me understand like, okay, land loss, coastal erosion, these sorts of things, even just those minor shifts in language to me can be deeply impactful. And so to go back to sort of this notion of environmental racism and this sort of interlocking experience, Hardy, Milligan, and Haynen, the folks who I referenced earlier, state that given how structural forms of racism facilitate the persistence of privilege, it affects this livelihood and the choices and the life chances that various folks have. And so when you look at these racial inequalities that are produced, they produce limited opportunities to address and alleviate the vulnerabilities that come with major life shifts, such as sea level rise and change through adaptation planning within underrepresented communities. So they're essentially advocating and saying that responses to sea level rise also must be attuned to racial difference and structures of inequality and inequity, so that folks can have a more race-aware adaptation. And that's not to say that class, et cetera, isn't prioritized. It means that they are interlocking. And if we are actually going to take a holistic view or come up with a holistic solution, we have to look at all of the layers and systems at play. And then lastly, the question, how are we centering, or I'm sorry, to actually go back, I had another bullet, not allowing colorblindness to inform how we position ourselves as receiver communities or our discussions of migration and adaptation. So one of the things that I have been thinking a lot about is like, what's my role? What can I do? But also thinking about just place overall. So for me, it's important to sort of situate this knowledge about environmental change, land loss, climate change in science and data, et cetera. Also, to situate it in that, but also to focus heavily on memories, observations, stories. So like Monique, your work really inspires me quite a bit because it's so deeply personal. And while you do sort of reference the more quantitative aspects of understanding land loss, you also bring in something that is directly connected to your own ancestry and your own life. And I think that arts organizations are uniquely poised to respond to that in a way that allows us to take on the task of supporting artists, culture bearers, et cetera, with the preservation of artifacts, memories, heritages, and we can really come together as collaborators to think about how we can use those tools as things that connect to advocacy efforts, et cetera. Like, how can we get these things in the forefront so that it's not just us saying this is what's happening, but we're also creating a platform for the people that we want to serve. Also, to kind of go back to my earlier point, if we move forward with sort of like a colorblind approach, thinking like, okay, well, yes, this affects everyone, it doesn't allow us to be honest about the limitations, reputations, or perceptions that we might have or will face as receiver communities. So for example, you might personally feel like, well, of course, everyone's welcome here. We serve everyone. But if someone's leaving an already traumatic situation, it's important to confront the blind spots you may have about your own institution, city, et cetera, because there might be challenges or an opportunity to support and build trust if someone is relocating to an area that they may or may not feel welcome in. So I think it's just important to remember that we don't operate in a vacuum. And it's important to ask ourselves, like, how are our organizations embedded within the place that we call home? And while we have our own sort of working knowledge and understanding, if someone is new to this place, they won't. So how do we sort of grapple with that as well? We can go to the next slide, Maida. So I just wanted to include this graphic that I thought was really interesting in an article that I came across. And it essentially is showing the concentration of African Americans in coastal communities of the contiguous United States. So the map displays the percentage of African Americans within those sort of dark gray regions is at about 20%. And that's above the national average of about 13.6%. So in these dark gray areas, you have about a 20% population density, which to me is very telling and very interesting. And this is only talking about one racial group, right? So if we know that these areas are eroding and these folks are going to move, at some point they may be forced to move, where are they going to go? What does it mean for all of the unique knowledge, cultural productions, et cetera, that exist within those places? Where do they go to? What happens to them? And also what may be other issues faced by these communities that may or may not be compounded by that relocation. So I'll stop there, but that was my input. Thank you.
Thank you. Wrong way. Okay. So what do we need to be doing? To me, there are at least two primary things. One is support the cultures of the coastal communities and prepare the receiver communities. But we can also be a service to the governor's office and such, in helping people understand that this is a statewide issue, because the arts has a way of being able to reach people in a different way than anything else. And there's a federal agency that's short name is called QIPWA, and they have actually told me their communications said, you all can help us make people understand that this is a statewide issue and not just a coastal issue. So Kelsey's gonna talk a little bit about how organizations could respond.
One of the things that Maida and I actually talked about this morning that kind of brought this all together for me is that when we come across a topic like this, I think we try to invent a new way of dealing with it, or a new process, or a new project. And if we really look at the work that most of you are doing right now, there is some kind of a system or a project or a process in place where this can either be plugged in or it can be applied to this. And so I know one thing that, we talk about with the cultural districts a lot, the regional arts councils are very familiar, looking at, like Charbonne was saying, just having conversations. That's the first step that we can have, but also looking at what can come from this. Maida's going to go through some specific examples of how artists have sort of stepped up and served in this role, but looking at, what do you have a public art campaign going on right now in your region or your parish? How can you approach this subject with that? Is there an artist residency opportunity, including Jonathan, I know you guys at Rougarou Fest having, more of a folk life and a narrative stage. So taking something that's already in existence and just thinking about how to plug this into the programming without having to reinvent something or add another, burden onto your existing staff people, which we all know are too few and far between. And so I think that's the main thing too. When we go back to what we talked about at the beginning, that this information, depending on your level of familiarity with it, we're working general to specificity. And so it's like what already exists where we can easily plug this in. In the cultural districts, we're not trying to give a regional arts council something new to do. We're not trying to give a tourism bureau something new to do. We're saying, hey, here's an extra tool. And so I think that's one thing as we think about those organizational responses of, what is your area great at? Is it storytelling? Is there a particular tradition in your area that we can really capitalize on and use this? Also tapping into LDOA, just keeping us involved in the conversations as you move forward, keeping us, abreast of whatever resources you come across, because you guys come across many different things than we will, and vice versa. And so I think that's one of the things that's almost like a sigh of relief to realize that there's a lot of work that's already going on. And it's really just trying to get back, like Maida said, back to intentionality around what can the organizations do? What can the groups of people do to plug this in a natural and organic way?
I'm going to share a little bit about how artists have responded. Xavier Cortada came to the Arts Summit 2 years ago, but I wanted to include an image of one of his projects. He's done international projects on all kinds of art and environment issues. But he created the Underwater Homeowners Association, and people could put these signs in front of their homes that say how many feet underwater it will be in the worst case scenarios. And I'm going to share a number of images with you. They're all Louisiana artists, but they're only the ones that I am aware of, but they're all addressing climate change here. I'm not going to discuss them, but as you'll see, there are artists of many disciplines that have responded with exhibits, productions, books, events. And if you know of others, please let us know in the chat that we need to be aware of. And I want to point out that many of these have had a residency at a studio in the woods, which has focused on this issue for several years. And I want to point out Brandon Bollinger. He's actually had numerous major exhibits all over the country. He's gotten quite a bit of attention with his work, as have some of the others, but Brandon really stands out in that regard. So we touched on this. What could happen with existing resources? We'll continue with the Bayou Culture Collaborative workshops. But I just wanted to throw out some ideas of infrastructure, things that LDOA and the regional arts councils could offer. We could go back and offer capacity building grants again, but target them specifically for this issue. Artist grants to engage communities, and then more sophisticated strategies like looking at opportunity zones. That's a much more complicated issue, but who knows? Okay, so now we'd like to open it up to discussion. Here are some ideas of things that we could offer to you and to support this idea to move forward. But I'd like to hear from others at this point.
Can I speak up? This is Jake.
Absolutely.
Hey everybody. For those of that don't know you, don't know me, I'm the visual arts director at Acadiana Center for the Arts. And I'm actually glad y'all were mentioning Brandon Ballinger. We'll be having an exhibition of his in our main gallery at ACA in October of this year. So October through January of October 2021, January 2022. So we'll be showing some of the pieces that he's been working on lately, as well as some pretty well-known pieces. But that might also be another time for us to get together again. So mark your calendars, and if things that you're working on are going to sync up with that in that time of year between October and January, please reach out and let me know. And I would love to have some sort of engagements. I would love to have some deepening of conversations, whether it goes in line with Brandon's work, or something that's just tangential, or something that broadens a certain aspect of what he does. So I think it'll be a great 4-month period for activating these ideas and raising some visibility to everything we're talking about over here. So please reach out and continue the conversation with that in mind. So I'm excited about all this stuff. I feel like we've got a lot of good things going here, and we're with the right group of people to do some further deepening of discussion. So that was it. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you, Jake.
I was in our planning process, I was saying how important it is for organizations and arts institutions to create pathways for folks to understand, how we got here, and that and to translate it, and also to recognize, just to echo what was said earlier by Maida, that folks are and also by Chabrion, that folks are traumatized, and so we're dealing with arts being able to be a healing space as well, as an educational space.
I just want to expand the idea of policymakers too, to include the school systems and educators, because I remember, in post-Katrina times, that was a big effect with population movement. You have people, appearing in public school classrooms who are traumatized and who are part of that population. And many of us, like the ACA, we work very directly in those schools and are already participating in these conversations around social and emotional learning and trauma-informed learning, and how, I've not really heard that topic discussed again in connection to this one. So I think schools, school systems, school districts as policymakers should really be a part of this focus. I'll just say the second thing when talking about policymakers, we hosted this morning the board meeting for the Acadiana Planning Commission, and there were three issues that were really their primary topics of discussion. One, obviously, like coronavirus, public health numbers. Two, long-term transportation development projects, as overlaps. And well, sorry, there's four. Three, the watershed and management of the watershed, especially around flooding issues. Hey, so that's at top of mind, and they get that it is a regional issue. And four, deployment of high-speed internet fiber in particular to rural communities, because the discussion that was had there was these communities will not exist as thriving places if people can't do their job there, because however many more jobs are going to require an internet connection in 50 years, and Abbeville will either have a population living there doing work that requires high-speed internet connection, or it will not. And so the importance of essentially what becomes information, access to information, in the long-term viability of places. But so they touched in some ways on one, the idea of watershed and changes that are happening there, and two, on the idea of population movement. But I have not seen this topic of actual population movement through land loss raised at all, and that's one of those rooms where it needs to be raised.
Great point, Sue.
This is Cheryl. I'm with the Treme 7 Ward Cultural District, but I'm also the Executive Director of Greater Treme Consortium. We've been in existence for 24 years, maybe even longer. And I am so happy that I was able to get in today because through my organization, my parent organization, Greater Treme, we've been in a collaboration with Waterwise Gulf South for the last 5 years. And this is the issue that we are tackling now, particular in communities of color. I live in Treme, I grew up in Treme, I work in Treme. And climate change and the environment is not a subject that we have talked about since, since I've been here, which is over 60 years. But for the last 6 years, we've been bringing this information to the community. And we've done it in a way to attract attention by using various artists to help bring attention to the planter boxes that we've been building that house first of all, they house native plants, but it also is a way to detain stormwater. It floods a lot in New Orleans, and so we've come up with various green installations to help prevent flooding in our community. And we've used those installations with the artwork on them to attract attention so that we can begin the conversation around climate change and green infrastructure in the environment. But I also think that it is a way for us to bring that information. I mean, New Orleans is a hospitality city. Everyone know that, but it's people don't come here to talk about the environment or climate change. But with the installations that we've been doing, I think that it's an opportunity for us to bring more people in because of the artwork that we are displaying on our work are scenes of New Orleans and in particular the culture of Treme. I'm gonna put the website on here, and I'm just inviting everyone to go there and take a look at the work that we're doing. And I am familiar with the presentation that you did with the migration of people moving from one city to the other. We are a Kresge grantee, and so yes, we've been talking about that for at least the past, well, since 2017 for sure. Years about the threat of flooding and land loss. So I'm really, really happy that I was able to come and be part of the Zoom meeting today. And I'm happy that, more and more people are talking about it in various outlets, the cultural district. And I wasn't really expecting, well, land loss, I understand that, but not to see information that I've already seen before and be able to have other people experience it also and know that it's real. And so, yeah, I'm glad that I was able to.
I'm so glad you were here today too, Cheryl, because I think that kind of underscores, Sharp Brown's comments about, again, having those conversations of people who are going through it in different ways, and then sharing that information of what if, for instance, with what y'all are dealing with as somebody who, is dealing with water on a continual basis, what kind of conversation could happen between y'all and a potential receiver community about the way that you're communicating your issues? They could communicate theirs, in a similar way. You see what I'm saying? And I think that's the cool part about starting this whole, I don't know we got to think of a cool name to call this, right? I mean, obviously made a Bayou Culture Collaborative is badass enough, but this collection of people that are trying to figure out, we can use that similar megaphone. Like Barry, I'm thinking about y'all. What if there's a way to partner with Cheryl and the folks down in Treme and talk about how, these parishes that are north of Ville Platte, to Monique's point, are going to be receiving people in the next, 25 to 50 years. So that's what has me thinking, is that what kind of conversations and what kind of projects could happen from using similar tactics, but to communicate different messaging.
Yes. And as soon as we are able to be amongst one another, you all are definitely invited to New Orleans. I'll be more than happy to give you all a tour of the work we've been doing. This work has made me so happy just, I'm a city girl. I was never used to digging in the dirt or planting or anything like that. But what I've learned over the past 5 years about how the environment and the lack of trees has harmed people in the Black community has opened my eyes. And I've just, through the work, been trying to get this information out. Waterwise, Gulf South has been intentional in what they've been doing because they work in 3 communities of color. Treme, the 6th ward, the 7th ward, and also the upper 9. They're also citywide, and I'm not trying to do a advertisement for them, but I'm just trying to impress upon you all that this was a good presentation, that I am glad that I came, and I am happy to know that you all are talking about it, that it's on your mind also, although this is a cultural organization, that the environment is very important, and especially here in New Orleans, in Treme. The culture is important, but we also need to know that without us providing a way to reduce flooding and to help plant more trees, that our culture is not going to be here.
So what do y'all think from the perspective of what you need to move forward from here? I know that's one of the main questions that Maida had posed was, you know, what help do you need? What do you think is next? You know, as an arts organization, a cultural organization, a cultural entity, like what do we think the next step is? What kind of support or resources or whatever do you think you might need?
So anytime I'm around Maida, she always gets me in my feelings. And so I am not going to feel bad if I cry. You guys, those of you who know me know that I'm a crier, and I'm not even ashamed about it. So if it happens, that's where I'm going to go. Maida, you had mentioned something about Terrebonne Parish, and I do want to get that. I want to get all those things that you read earlier from you, if I can, just so I could read them myself one more time. You mentioned that folks of Terrebonne Parish don't leave Terrebonne Parish and that we stay here. And there was also, we also were in the news recently as one of the parishes in the country, local governments, local subdivisions, that we were not willing to take the vaccine. So I think 48% of people said that they either would or wouldn't, whatever it was like the most number of people said they would not take the vaccine. And then it made me think, I wonder, this is a sidebar conversation for later, but I wonder if there's any connection between any of that. What I think that we need as leaders in communities of loss, it's going to be, and I don't know what this looks like, but it's going to be a skill set that enables us to curate that loss for the community and for the people as we're losing it, right? And in that curation, there has to be beauty and acceptance, and letting us know that it's okay. Right? Yes, we have to have some plans going into the future of where you're moving to. But the part where I got into my feelings earlier and crying on my side of the Zoom was, as we were talking about this, I remembered my dad passing away a few years ago and my mom being next to him. And I watched her as she told him that it was okay to go. And then he died. Moments after she said, it's okay. And I think what we are going to need as leaders is our communities are going to need that person that says it's okay now. Like you're tired and you can't go anymore. And it's okay to go. I don't know what that looks like.
Well, I think it's keeping that, it's literally keeping the human element in mind. right? About saying like it's okay to admit that this is scary. Even like that at the beginning of it, I should have just been more forthright when I was talking about general to specific and a funnel and all. Basically, it's saying like this is scary, and we have to figure out what is our role as this. And I think that's why all those examples that Maida listed out on individual slides, y'all, those are living, working artists, some of whom are on the call that are doing the work already, right? Like everybody on this call is doing that work already. And so I think that's what inspires me and moves me past just staying in my feelings. Because by the way, I cried on a Zoom with Maida earlier today, for the record, not about this, about an elephant dying, but that's another story. But anyway, so I think that for me is what keeps me, like Charbonnet keeps saying, solutions oriented. And maybe that solution is to say, it's okay to go, right? Like it's okay to say, number one, it's okay to say this is scary. Number two, it's okay to say, we don't even know what to do next. And maybe that's where we end today, and that's okay. But it's like saying, to your point, Jonathan, that human capital, that human element in all of this is how, Bayou Culture Collaborative started, in my opinion. That's really what's been woven throughout all of this. And we've seen that a lot with COVID, right? Those resources about saying how to gracefully die as an organization. There's a lot of federal, groups out there right now that are providing resources to nonprofits and all that about how to gracefully transition, into whatever that next phase is. So I think that's, something we would have to talk about.
What I'm saying is the people who, if in Terrebonne parishes, I mean, many of the coastal parishes of Louisiana are this way. If we don't move, and it's a lot of people who aren't taking the vaccine, the leaders, we as leaders in our communities are going to have to be the ones with that skill set that help them through. And look, and I mean, I am not a therapist. You know what I mean? I use these sessions as my therapy sessions and cry with you guys. So like, and I'm sorry. Again, I just go back to how do we curate this? Because we can. And how do we help those folks that will drown to usher them in a way that because they're gonna want to be locked in. And Monique knows this too. Like they're just gonna be like, we live here. This is what we do. I'm not leaving yet. And at some point we have to usher them on and say it's okay.
Well, Jonathan, I think your comments really illustrate that different parts of the state needs different things now. And, how do we address that? While it's sad that we are on the forefront of all of this, the good thing is you're first in line with foundation funding. Because the ones that start getting to this in 20 years, it's not going to be the trending subject that they want to fund. So the big thinkers out there, if this is a time to make those approaches to foundations and some of the federal government agencies, because you're basically first in line. The bad thing is you're first in line.
I think that might also speak to the possibility of scale. Made his point about thinking big. Like if we could think big, in whatever we feel our role is as a cultural response, an artistic response. It's almost like, nobody's ever had to do this before. And so we can kind of just make it what we want, so to speak. Charbonnet, I saw that you had unmuted.
Yeah, y'all had touched on a good bit, but I was just thinking about, to Jonathan's point, about what it means to think about voice. So it makes me think about earlier when I was saying, like, what does it mean to think about like how you are situated within your communities, within your cities? Like, I think about, to even use family, right, as an example. Jonathan makes me think about my grandma, where my family is like, oh, you have to deal with her because we can't deal with her. She'll listen to you. She won't listen to us, but she'll listen to you. Like I can somehow magically, as her granddaughter, get through to her in a way that if anybody else comes, it's like brick wall, no, not trying to hear it. Okay. So to use the grandma effect, so to speak, how does that translate institutionally where we all do, whether we realize it or not, have constituents, groups, people, individuals, whether we know them in our own like neighborhoods and communities, whether they come through our doors, et cetera, who don't really want to hear what maybe this policymaker or politician over here has to say, or this organization up on this hill who never came down to like check on them any other time anyway has to say. But if it's coming from you or coming from us, they'll hear it and they'll receive it in a particular way. And so I think I just wanted to affirm that point and to say yes, because I've seen it happen in my own personal and professional experience where if you know that certain things may not stick unless they are coming from you, how are you making sure that you are getting that necessary information out through whatever platforms, like Kelsey was saying, whether it's through programming, whether like Ms. Cheryl, if it's through the work that you're doing with the boxes, whatever the case might be. I think there is sort of this leaning into one's own power and one's like organization's power in a positive way. It's very easy to feel like disheartened at times, especially if you're working in the arts. We're all trying to figure it out. State wants to cut our money, they don't want to give us money on a national level, all these other things. But the power is with and has always been with the people. If it were not for people, we wouldn't have a purpose. So that's just my 2 cents.
I'm seeing in the chat that there's different needs at different times. And it's just making me think about, I was recently in conversation with the Historic New Orleans collection and talking about, just like what is an institutional role in times like this past summer, right? Where we're like every week we're up against a new storm, and to think about it from an artist perspective of like, what does an artist need, but also to think about a historical perspective and an institutional museum perspective. It's like, what can those institutions do with the resources to help preserve things? Because we are, Jonathan, at a time where we're having to choose what we hold on to and what we let go of. And my belief is that just because it's in the red zone doesn't mean that we're sacrificing that. Like, the red zone is still sacred, and there are places and there are people and there are individuals who aren't going anywhere. And so, what is that like in between, especially during these times? Because of course, when disaster strikes, things start moving. And like, I think that it's important for us to wait for those moments and to prepare and anticipate them, because that's when the learning curve can happen. And that's when like movement can happen too. And that's when decisions get made for better or worse. And so, being kind of on the forefront, ready for that and anticipating and figuring out ways to support and collaborate, I think are really important.
I'm interested in learning more about LA Safe, and I know it's obviously a giant printed plan, but is there a digest of the kind of cultural recommendations?
Yes, and I have compiled 2 lists that could help. I did do I excerpted the LA Safe parts that relate to the arts, but all of these resources are online, and I have a list of all these different resources, and also a list of all the players, the federal, state agencies, the nonprofits, the key nonprofits. They're just amazing number. You think there are a lot of arts nonprofits? The environmental world has just as many. So, I could do a session that just reviews some of these basics for the ones that want to get more, go a little deeper in preparation for a dialogue. I would probably need help to do one that's more grounded in the science. Maybe Jonathan could help with something like that. Sorry to throw you out there, Jonathan. Another big topic is being a receiving community. And there is a great resource on communities receiving immigrants. And you could basically swap out immigrant for climate migrant. And it's basically really well-designed arts projects, that have more dialogue and not just pushing out to the community. Your boards, I could do an abbreviated part of this for your boards if that's an issue. I have been asked to speak to a number of people. Actually, I've gotten more attention with this project than I have with any other project I've done from beyond the arts world. So there's a number of things that I could personally do to help continue this dialogue.
Maida, I have a question. I came in a little bit late. Kelsey, thank you for throwing me the life raft. I couldn't get in. So, and Jonathan, there's nothing wrong with tears. Everybody knows over there at the LDOA, the Arts Council, that I cry my share. So it's a good deal, buddy. Eat your Wheaties, cry your tears. No problem with that. For me, and I'm sure for everyone, and I'm going to give you a metaphor, but it's kind of, I'm going to turn it on its head. This is kind of, it's a crisis, but if we look at it as the Titanic, except we're looking at the Titanic, we saw what happened to the Titanic, and that's why we're talking today. We know what's going to happen if nothing gets done before, if there's no proactive. So if we're going to look at this and try to, avert this at some level, what do the scales, if we're going to scale this mountain, what do my pike sets on the mountain that I scale, what do they say? What are the top 5 things that we need to make as what we reach for? I think that all of us want to do, the speakers were fabulous. Y'all have done a great job. It seems like there's so many points that are in despair that if we spray the field too thinly, we may not be effective. So I'm thinking the reverse is that we offer a recommendation that we come up with. It's hard to whittle this down to a couple, so I'm not going to go there. Some bullet points that I can put my hand on and go somewhere and have a conversation that I can get this, I can check that off my list and I can grow this on my list. But to have this notion that all the interesting and the valued people, families are depending on us to do something, to intervene without some level of, I'm a checklist kind of girl. I work from my checklist and I'm very duplicitous, but I think that would help someone like me start our conversation, because this is such a large, encompassing issue. It's not even a concept, it's an issue.
Well, it's a super wicked problem. The scientists,
I
call it. That is exactly.
I know that we all work in our spaces with problems, the goals and objectives of what do I need to get done, and that's going to slay that dragon. So I'm looking for bullet points. I'm looking for things that I can own and slay. But
when we think about, Cheryl's wonderful example of the work in Treme, I mean, right there, that's project-based, project-oriented communication about an issue. And so, whenever we're thinking about what we do here in DOA, it's offering up those resources, like Maida talking about coming to speak to your board. And so that now the board knows. And then it's the board saying, what projects to, the points earlier, what projects are already in existence where this work can naturally fit. And it's, to Monique's point about looking at the history of the land that you're on, how does that inform the work that we're doing? Dr. Charbrion's points about learning the history so that we can move forward in these projects. And so I think those things, like Mary, I think the things, to Connie Castle's point, it's different for different parts of the state. But I mean, that structure is pretty straightforward, and we've got some examples, in the presentation and in the chat where I think, if you want marching orders, to me, I do think we need more of these conceptual conversations, like this group of people, a fluid, group of people that are in these leadership positions. But I also think, like, to me, that's what it kind of looks like is forming up from this, is like that communication and education component, but then also it taking shape. Maida's point to me, I'm speaking for Maida, so tell me to hush up, Maida, is that the artists assume that role. They're that megaphone, right? And so I think maybe that's the point about, like, how do we empower them to do that? So maybe that's short-term goal. I mean, long-term goal, is to Jonathan's point, saying it's okay. Whatever it's okay to do, that's that long-term goal. But I think that short-term goal is to empower those artists with resources and knowledge to be able to translate that. Nobody else has that ability like they do.
I just want to throw this out real quick, and it's in term, and I promise I hate philosophical idea kind of things. I'd rather see things on the ground and in action. But when we talk about resilience, right, and it's a buzzword, but resilience in terms of risk and vulnerability equals the impacts of what happens. I think that as leaders, if we are given tools or ideas or skills to reduce the vulnerability of the people in the community, then that helps this whole thing, right? So when we say the risk, let's say the risk is the hurricane, and the hurricane's coming. And then if you are more vulnerable, like let's say you're in a wheelchair or you have only $5 to evacuate with, what are things that we can do as the arts community to lessen the vulnerability of the people who are super vulnerable, and helping them to, and again, I'm talking from a community of loss, not receiving. But I think if we figure, and I don't know the answer to that, but I mean, lessening vulnerability is that having events that people communicate with each other and build networks to where Little Miss Ethel has a way out because she's friends with the neighbor now because she didn't know that before, and it wouldn't have happened unless you wouldn't have had your little festival or event or arts thing, something to that effect. Yeah, that's it.
Well, I want to talk about the idea that I know this is overwhelming, and I've been through your phase of like, oh my God, it was like, this is way bigger than I ever imagined. But in working with the science groups, like when I presented at BitNep management conference, they really encouraged me to be positive and to offer solutions. And at first it's like, what? How am I supposed to be positive about this? But the more I thought about it, the reason I'm continuing, I'm really here talking to you today is because the arts are part of the solution. We have power, we can harness people in ways that other groups just don't even know how to do it. The theater productions. I didn't go into a Cry You one, but there are other ways. The arts have a way to reach people, and whether it's therapeutic or strategic or whatever, we have a role to play in this. And that's basically why I'm keep pushing this. This is basically what I talk about all the time. And to help the tradition bearers, I'm really happy to be able to focus so specifically on passing on traditions. But yeah, I warned Kelsey that when we got to the discussion point, there was probably going to be silence because it takes time to absorb this and then think about it. And I went through that. I've been there. I'm just been doing this a little bit longer. And I want to say that we and I are late to this. The environmentalists have been dealing with this, and the Jonathan Forays and such. I'm just trying to add a new twist to it. And I think structurally with LDOA grants, the Regional Arts Council grants, we can do a lot just helping the artists do what they want to do.
I mean, artists are storytellers, artists of all different types of storytellers. I wonder, because I think about the people in my daily life that, are not in the intersection of this. They're not people that are in vulnerable communities. They're people that are here in Baton Rouge, up in the Boyles, up in the other parishes that are receiving communities, that this is in no way, shape, or form on their radar. How do we go about telling the story of telling the story in a compelling enough way that it's not just science, it's not just art, it's melding of the two and like intertwining it with the importance of the culture and what makes Louisiana so special? How do we tell those stories in a way that actually compels those people to pay attention and want to get involved in the dialogue and want to understand it a little bit more? Obviously, they're not going to just immerse themselves. My parents aren't going to immerse themselves in the concept of Clocheville, Louisiana being a receiving community, but there may be something in there because we're native French speakers that compels them enough to at least try to understand how they might be involved or at least to want to interpret some of the things that have been lost or are at risk of being lost over the next 20, 30, 40 years. I don't know.
We were Kelsey and I were brainstorming on what could be next, and is to feature some of the art, a studio in the woods and artists that have been doing this other than Monique, and broaden the audience. We very intentionally kept this to these 4 groups for this audience, but to broaden it to all the arts organizations and to artists. And we could just keep repeating that in different ways. That's what I've come up with. But
so some of the techniques that we've used are workshops. We have training workshops that we conduct monthly. It's open to the public. I can send you some information on that. But we also have tours. We have tours throughout the city. We take them to sites that we have created. And we teach people how to install rain barrels. I know we're talking about land loss, but the land is not going to be lost like right now. So there are some preventive means that we can look at, which is basically what my collaboration with WaterWise is. And I basically just want people to know that there's something we all can do to prevent flooding, because that's a big issue in New Orleans. So if it's flooding, we are losing land and people, because people are sick. But I'll be more than happy to see if they will, they'll be more than happy to conduct a 101 workshop with you all, just to talk about the training, the green infrastructure, stormwater management. We have a workshop on how to build a rain barrel, planter boxes, native plants, everything just about anything that can help slow down land loss and erosion. In their simple techniques. It's not anything big. As a matter of fact, what made me want to stick and be in a collaboration with WaterWise is the New Orleans Urban Water Plan I just stumbled upon before I started working with WaterWise. And the techniques that they were talking about was what do I want to say? I can't think of the word, but they wanted to reincorporate areas that had French drains, where people had French drains on their property, or the basins that was, all throughout the city, where there are dishes now. The dishes are still, the impressions of what was there is still there, but it's just sitting there. It's not helping at all to help the water recede back into the ground. So it's those type of things also that can help, maybe, helpfully. I'm not a scientist. I'm a community person, okay? But those are the type of things that I see can help reduce flooding around people's homes. And this field, as you said, is so vast. I was reading so much about the environment, about climate change, the effects that it's having on Black folks, why we have hypertension and the causes of it, living in an urban environment all my life, not knowing that concrete would have such an effect on me and my family, that I had to stop. It's so overwhelming. But what I saw when I started working with WaterWise, a planter box was built, and I immediately thought of our culture as a way to introduce this to the people in the community. So I'm a big fan of art. And I know that artists have a way of having people talk to one another in a way where people can express themselves in a situation where this conversation may never come up if I'm out just socializing and networking at a strictly business function. If it's not about the climate or green infrastructure or the environment, they may never talk about it. But if I'm out and about in the community and someone say, well, what is that? Who is that on the box? Why is it there? Then I could tell them the purpose and the reason why the box is there with artwork on it. So
I'll run through the rest of the slides. They're just resources. I just want y'all to be aware of some of these. This is the one on immigration that could be is excellent. And I have all this. I can send it to you. BitNep already did a wonderful unit on using the arts to understand ecology. If you want to really understand the Louisiana situation, Shirley Loska's book is by far the best. It's a Google document online, a really complicated one, but it's there. This is where the graphics are, Matthew Hauer's work. There are ways to connect through the Louisiana Folklore Society, the Bayou Culture Collaborative Facebook group, and then I manage an email list through Constant Contact. And then the web page for Bayou Culture is louisianafolklife.org Bayou Culture. But that basically, I'm here, I'm available to continue talking. We are over time, but we'd like to push out there next steps. Does anybody have a thought